that you do, so if I go through them, feel free to skip them in your presentation. Let's see. Again, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the automation track for this fall's MN365 Admin Workshop Day. This is the 10:30 session in the Automate track. If you are in the wrong place, please go back to the mn365.org calendar and click on the link for the correct track. Lisa Severson is going to be presenting on leveraging PowerApps and Flow in the public sector, going through use cases and lessons learned through her experience. Thank you, Lisa, for joining us. Some quick notes, just administrative tasks. This meeting is being recorded. Please mute yourself prior to the presentation so we don't get any background noise. If you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to raise your hand or put a question in the chat session. Lisa, if you're comfortable with it, I'll allow people to just come off mute and ask the question after you call on them. If you guys need live captioning, in the upper right-hand side, 3-dot ellipsis, you can turn on live captioning and it will dictate the meeting for you. At the end of this session, we'll be giving away a $25 Amazon gift card to a drawing at random based on the number or the people who are still in the session at the end. Again, the grand prize at the end of the entire admin day will be drawn based on the survey submissions. Survey submissions can be found at this URL. It will be posted in the chat later on or by scanning that QR code. Please do not fill out the survey until the end, as we don't want hundreds of individual submissions and 95,000 entries. So thank you all for your compliance with that. I'd like to thank our sponsors for today's admin workshop day, those being Microsoft, Concurrency, Now Micro, Cyber Advisors, RBA, and Arctic Wolf. Their financial support allows us to do these admin days, and hopefully sometime in the next year or 6, when COVID's gone, we'll be back in session and be able to see people face to face. But thank you again to all these sponsors. If anyone is interested in being a sponsor, please reach out through the MN365 website and we can start that conversation. So I will turn this over to Lisa at this point and stop sharing my screen. Lisa, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Okay, great. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. Hi, everybody. My name is Lisa Severson, and the session is Leveraging PowerApps and Flow in the Public Sector. A little bit about me. I am currently the Microsoft 365 lead at Bar Engineering. It is week 3 on the job for me at that job. Prior to that, I was actually the IT operations manager for Minneapolis Public Schools. I've also worked for St. Paul Public Schools. I have over 12 years of education sector experience. And in Minneapolis, before I was the operations manager, I was a process analyst. So my background is very much process focused, trying to make things work better, kind of business analyst-y. My educational background is in communications and education. So I don't have any coding experience. I don't know programming languages. I'm very much what they like to call a citizen developer. So if you're using the Power Platform, if you have analysts in your company that like to create process improvements or business process solutions, getting them involved with Power Apps and Power Automate is a really great thing and great way to go. At MPS, our journey started in 2018. We were on SharePoint 2010, and we needed to migrate over to SharePoint Online. And over the years in SharePoint 2010, we created a number of InfoPath forms that had approval workflows associated with them. So when we started this project, I didn't really know what PowerApps was at all. I just figured PowerApps is the way to do forms. So for us, our first use case that we started using PowerApps and Power Automate with was for forms and approval workflows. The first form that we started with was a student data access request form. So if a new staff person started and they needed access to our student data or student data systems, they would have to fill out a form, request it from their principal. An approval workflow would go to the principal, and once they approved, then it would go to IT so that IT could grant access to those various systems. When we started, we had a SharePoint list. SharePoint was where we were housing the majority of our data, and it's where most of our apps connect to, because it's just easy to set up those lists, and we had experience using those. When we first started, we created the list and then tried to connect the app from within the SharePoint list. And back in 2018, it looked a little bit different, and there were some weird scrolling issues. It looks now that they've changed it so that you create an app instead of customize it in PowerApps. But the issue, if you go this route, the benefit is it gives you a gallery and an edit form and a success screen, but your screen size and orientation is limited to portrait or landscape of like the tiny phone setting. So instead of doing it this route, because we wanted it to be a larger type of form, most of our apps are created straight from PowerApps. We create a Canvas app from blank. You can also create from within PowerApps from a data source, but again, it might give you that smaller phone size formatting. But for us, most of our users were accessing via their computer. So we chose tablet as the option, and then you get the option to change your orientation and change your screen size based on what most of your users are doing. So we had it all set up. We connected it to our data source. We tried to sign in as a test user, and we came upon this allow screen, and I hate this allow screen. It was, from a user experience perspective, kind of like the bane of our existence. And when we were starting using PowerApps, we thought, we can't implement them with this screen in here, because we try and teach users not to click on random buttons that they don't know what they're accessing. And so we thought this, could scare some of our users. They're not always the most technically savvy type people. So we needed a way to bypass this for our PowerApps to really be successful. So I hit the Google, and there's a link down here to the article that talks about the actual steps you need to take to do this. It requires a global admin. So this is where I couldn't do it. I had to pass it off to somebody on our server team. They are the co-owner of whatever app you create, and then they run a script that basically accepts those permissions on behalf of whatever user is using it. So instead of logging in and seeing that allow screen, they log straight into the app. So it provides a much more seamless user experience. You do want to be careful, especially within the public sector, if there's confidential or sensitive data that they might be accessing, where you want that additional, level of allow of have they actually agreed to use these connectors, or if your app is maybe sending an email on behalf of the person, you might want to still keep that in there. But if it's just writing to a SharePoint list or accessing your Office 365 users, it's probably pretty safe to bypass that screen. So like I said, most of our first forms or first PowerApps were to replace forms. And so we thought forms. Microsoft Forms look like this. Google Forms look, up and down. So we will make our layout be portrait style. And then we had some users say, why is there so much extra blank space on the sides? So when you're setting up your app, it's a real pain. If you try and change from portrait to layout mode, you have to redo a bunch of things. So really think about what type of device will users be using to access your app and build it that way. When I started, I was thinking of it as a forms input, and it really is more app-based. So just think of how your users will be accessing it. When we started implementing approvals, if you haven't been using approval workflows in your organization, they're a really handy tool. When we started, we had to communicate the change with our users so they would know what to expect, again, so that they weren't clicking on the wrong things. In Minneapolis, we had a lot of Mac users, and back then actionable messages from within the email were not available. So make sure that those are set up for your users and that they know how to use them, and then train and test. There was one person who kept saying, I'm clicking approve on this. And I went down to look at her computer and see what she was doing because there wasn't any action step within the flow. And she would click approve and the comments screen would show up, and then she didn't realize she had to click the submit button. So even things as simple as that you would think during testing, oh, this is an easy thing. It's not always easy for whatever your users are. If you are going to be doing approvals, setting reminders is really helpful for staff. Sometimes if you have supervisors or managers that get a whole bunch of emails, it gets lost in the shuffle. So we had flows that would set a delay. And then once they did an approval, it would set a supervisor approval variable to done. So the couple day delay would check, is the variable set to done? If it is, don't send a reminder. If it's not, send a reminder to the person that they still have an approval waiting. And we would also send a link to our people who had requested the thing, letting them know, here's the link that your supervisor can click on to access any pending approvals that they might have. Again, you want to be careful with how many reminders you're sending and how often, because people also get annoyed with having too many emails sent out. One other situation we use PowerApps with the approval workflows for was the time off request. I actually built it off of the app that's existing within PowerApps. There's a time off request template. So if you haven't used templates within PowerApps, those are kind of nice to take and then build off of. And that would do an approval. And once the item was approved, we created an item in our vacation calendar with just the basic details, not the reason why, but just that this person would be off. So if you have staff that are working at multiple locations, we had about 70 different school sites, 30 techs that were working at those different sites. It was really helpful for the managers to be able to see who's going to be where and to be able to decide if they should grant the approval request or not. And then it was also helpful for our service desk. If somebody needs something at a particular school, they were able to check and see if the field tech was out or not for the day. So, you know, potential uses, they're endless, but as far as requests go, access requests, time off requests, procurement approval requests, anything that's I want to submit my data and then get an approval, PowerApps and PowerAutomate are really great for that. One of the next things that we used PowerApps for was the camera feature. We have a bunch of furniture at various different buildings that needed to be tracked and inventoried so it could be sent out to various places. There's certain regulations for disposition of assets for education institutions. So our facilities people came to me and said, we want to be able to, you know, gather all of the information on what we've got and where it is, and then let people, you know, pick from it and kind of shop for this available inventory to see, do they need chairs sent or a table? So for this app, it uses the camera input. This one was set up for a phone layout because the 6 people that were creating the inventory all had district provided cell phones. So in that case, we just made it use that feature. And for this, it saved the photo to a SharePoint list and had 2 lists. One list was for the furniture categories and subcategories, and then the second list was for the inventory to be collected. So this is the first screen. The next button is only visible if there's a photo that's been taken, so they can't get to the next screen unless they've taken a photo of their furniture item. And then they get to a screen that has a category that they can select from. So that category is housed in a gallery, which pulls from the SharePoint inventory categories list. So the subject matter expert really is in charge of what categories show up there and what subcategories show up in there. And then in the next screen, they get to pick their location, enter their quantity, and then they click submit. And then they figured they needed a way to be able to track that inventory. You could, you know, have it print out a barcode based on this ID number, but they decided to just, you know, make it be easy and have some stickers available. So they would write item number 462, stick it on the chair, and then if somebody requested item 462, they would know the location, how many were there, and then be able to confirm that that was the correct item. One thing we've learned through creating multiple apps is wherever possible, put the end users in charge of their content, especially if there are going to be changes to it, because in IT, you know, we're always tasked with doing a lot of different things. There's not always a lot of time. So wherever you can have your data that shows up within the app be more of a dynamic data source, like a SharePoint list that's editable by the subject matter expert, then you don't have to do as much work within IT of going in and updating, you know, fields and choice options. And then using galleries in PowerApps is a great way to display that kind of content. The save photo feature of this one was giving me fits at first, and maybe Microsoft has changed something to make it a little bit easier for people. I'm not sure, but back when I created this one, it would take the photo and then it just wasn't writing back to the SharePoint list. So we accomplished that through a PowerApps button flow. And when the user submits the SharePoint form, on success of that, it runs this PowerApps flow, which gets the last submitted ID number of it and gives it a PNG. So this gives it a file name. It takes this first photo, which was the photo of the chair, and then it sets the last submit ID, which is then used within that for the file content. So then this key piece here is having your file content be data URI to binary, and then it adds the attachment content into your SharePoint list. So the camera feature within PowerApps can be used for if you have site inspections and you need to take a picture of like, this is what this site looked like at the time, or if you have accident reports. We've also used it as a potential option for ID badges. If you have a new user who comes in and you could just have a computer set up where they can enter their data, take, you know, as many versions of their photo as they want, and then submit the final one, and then have that go somewhere else so that people can create the ID badges for people. That's a nice central repository. When I started at NPS, I went to orientation and they took my picture and I thought, great, it'll be there on my first day. And then I went through the first day and the security guy said, I don't have your picture. And I said, they took it. And, you know, it had gone into somebody's digital camera into no man's land. You could also use the camera function for doing inventory, like I showed in the previous example. Another feature within PowerApps that we use a lot is the barcode scanner. Back when COVID started in March, we had a whole bunch of devices that we needed to deploy out to our students. We ended up handing out, I think, about 18,000 devices in the spring to students to be used for distance learning. And keeping track of what those devices were, what the asset number was, and who they were assigned to was really important for reporting purposes, and just so we knew what we had on hand and what we had handed out, just, you know, for quick visibility. So for this one, unfortunately, I couldn't get a video of it within my phone, but if you use your phone and the scanner feature, it basically uses the camera feature of your phone. So if you click the scan button, it pulls up your camera with a little line through it, and then you know, kind of hover over where the barcode is, and then it will track that barcode number into a text field or somewhere else that you've designated. We did have a lot of people ask if they could use a handheld barcode scanner, because the one within the PowerApps does work, but it's a little bit slower than if you use a handheld one. So if you are using barcodes and checking out a whole bunch of stuff at one time, it might be easier to just use the text input field, like give people options. So for this one, they could either click the scan button or they can click within the field and then use a handheld scanner, which basically tracks that in as text. So there's two different options for that. We also use the barcode scanner feature for staff devices. We used to have a paper form when a new person would start. IT would print off the form, handwrite all of the device data like serial number, barcode number, date that it's put into service. And then the person would sign that form. Somebody would scan it to PDF. It would get emailed to some email box and not really tracked very well. So this was a replacement for that, both to help us with inventory and asset management and to streamline the approval process. So for this one, you use the barcode scanner feature to scan the device barcode. And then it has a PowerApps button flow. So when this checkout agreement gets sent, if they click that button, then it sends this checkout agreement form, which is basically an approval workflow that goes to the requester. So it says you've had a device checked out. It tracks all of the data of the device within the SharePoint list. And then an approval goes to the person saying, do you agree to the terms of this device checkout? So that's nice. It's also a good way to get people used to using approval flows, because the first thing they see when they start a new job at MPS was this approval checkout digital approval flow that they had to click approve on. Another thing we got asked to do a lot was make PDFs, and that is a feature that's not natively available within PowerApps, so we had to find a couple different workarounds. Some departments really like PDFs, and they are good for having consistent formatting, or if you have specific forms that have to be in a certain format for state mandated or reporting purposes. There are two different options that I've used for creating PDFs. There's a cheap method or the easy method. You can be cheap or easy. I prefer the easy method. The first method is the cheap one, which is to create an HTML file and then create the PDF off of that. And I've got a flow of that in a minute. And then the easy method is a fillable Word template that you convert to a PDF. So cheap method, we did this before we had a premium connector within Power Automate. So what it does is it gets the content of your logo and initializes a variable and then composes HTML. So the drawback of using this method, so within your HTML, you can see there's a lot of different custom fields. So these are all fields from the SharePoint list data that can be put into there. We did have an issue with this image. We wanted the MPS logo in there. And to get that in there correctly, the code for it had to have an @ sign. And every time we would save, then go back into it and make an edit, it had like wiped out that @ sign. It's a quirk of Power Automate that happens sometimes. So to get around that, our variable had our @ sign in it so that it couldn't wipe it out when we saved and re-edited the flow. The drawback of this one is if anything ever needs to change, IT really has to be the people that go in and change it, because end users don't know how to use HTML, and then we don't give them access to this flow because we don't want them breaking anything within it. Once the HTML is composed, then you do a create file, convert that file to PDF, and then we created the file in our SharePoint site. And then later we had to go in and delete this file. So you create the file, convert it, and then you delete it. And it did work. It just was kind of futzy. The easy method, if you don't have a Power Automate premium license, I would suggest getting one of those. If you have a service account that sends most of your flows, you could just assign it to that account. You can buy just individual licenses per user, whichever user needs to use those premium connectors. And the connector that I use for the easy method is this Microsoft Word fillable Word template connector. So again, it's much easier. There's only 4 steps here. You populate the Word template, set a delay, because I did find that if we didn't have like a 10-second delay, the flow would fail on the convert action like every 20 times or so. So sometimes after you do a populate, you just need like a 10-second delay. And then convert it to PDF and then just add the attachment to your SharePoint list, and it adds it as a PDF. You can take it a little step further. If you wanted somebody, maybe you could input a signature field into something. For our bus pass, they decided they wanted it revised so that they could have a student barcode in there. So to get the barcode, we were creating a URL based off of this barcode website, but to get the content of the image of that barcode, use this HTTP connector, which is helpful for all kinds of things, but especially if you're getting images from or data from some other website. This is also a premium connector. You use the get function of this and then whatever your barcode is, then create the file with whatever your file name is. It was a barcode.png. And then the file content goes here. Then you can get the file content and add that into your fillable Word template if you've added the image web part within your fillable Word template. So that can be handy if you have a lot of pictures that are maybe stored on your external website that people could access, and you just wanted to point to those pictures and say, I want to take that picture based on some item within the Power App that they've selected. Say they selected the bus option, you'd want to take the picture of the bus and put that into your fillable Word template. Or if they select the nutrition option, you'd want to take the picture of the apple and put that into your fillable Word template. So the HTTP connector, also premium connector, is a really handy one. And then what the form looks like, the PDF looks like when it's filled out here. All of these are just fillable, these fillable fields. The barcodes here are that barcode image that they wanted in there that the bus drivers can then scan the barcode to find the student ID number. This logo is just an image logo, but the benefit of doing it this way is, again, putting the control in the hands of the subject matter experts, where if they want to change the verbiage about anything, if they want to update your logo, make something look different within it, change the formatting, as long as they don't change any of the fillable Word fields, they can, change content within the template that the flow is pulling from. And it frees up time for IT. Another thing that we found is sometimes people will lose the email with the record of it. So for most of our Power Apps, we include some kind of a gallery or history of a display. If it's a request form, we'll show a gallery of any of their submitted items and the status so they can keep track of those. Or in this case, for the bus pass form, we had this little attachment guide, which was only visible if there was an attachment listed. And then they could, get back to that PDF and print it out for later use. One other thing we learned with the bus pass form, if you're using PowerApps, is to check about your licensing. We had some users that are not MPS staff, but they needed access to our various different systems, so they got an MPS account. But because it was not a regular account, the licensing hadn't been configured to allow them PowerApps licensing. So we had this whole, bus pass form request process built out, and then all these people at our partner sites or our contract alternative sites would try and access the form, and then they didn't have access to it. So just test it with anybody who might be using your licensing. PowerApps are great for kind of small use cases and internal, or at least the Canvas apps are. But if you're doing external sharing, you might need a different type, like a PowerApps portal or something else. But if you're using Canvas apps, they're great for internal use. One other use that we've had for PowerApps was creating kind of shopping carts and for doing inventory management. The first one that I did for inventory management is we have a consumables library, and they had about 500 different items of workbooks or worksheets that people could request for their students. And they were housing it all in some weird SQL database that could only be accessed from one computer. And it was really just a list of 500 items that you could have done in Excel, but we turned it into a SharePoint list and then let people request, and then it would reduce the inventory when it got sent out. Right before I left Minneapolis, they had an app to allow schools to do PPE requests. So there's a need at our schools to make sure that they had the right PPE equipment at our different sites. And that inventory was all controlled centrally by our procurement department and our operations departments. but we needed to find a way to allow schools to be able to request stuff to be sent to the school. So for this one, when I first started using PowerApps, I went to a training called PowerApps in a Day. And I thought at the time, there's no way you can make a Power App in a day. Like, there was a little bit of a steep learning curve. This one I made in, the first draft was about 2.5 hours. And then we had about an hour of meetings and working on the flow, and then maybe another half hour of testing. So it was under 8 hours. The whole thing was done, including the flow and the app and the SharePoint list creation. So once you start, getting used to Power Apps, they can be really, really quick to develop and implement. So this one, and unfortunately, because I'm not at MPS anymore, I couldn't have any live demos, so I'm sorry about that. It's all PowerPoint based. But this one has 2 SharePoint lists. One is an item list with the quantities and details, and that is controlled again by our subject matter expert in the procurement area. They can go in, and if we have additional types of PPE that are then added to the inventory list, they could go in and add those. And then this data displays in a gallery. So again, it's just pulling all of the data about the picture and the description and the each type all pulls from a SharePoint gallery. There's also a field in the SharePoint list that has a maximum quantity. So they didn't want people to go crazy and start requesting a whole bunch of stuff that they didn't need. So each of the items within the SharePoint list has a max quantity. And so what this code does is if this item is, the on visible of this box here is if this item is selected and the value is greater than the max request quantity of the item, then it will show this error message and it will disable the button. So they can't enter items in here that are over the maximum quantity. So once they've lowered their quantity and added it, it adds to the cart. The add to cart button selects the item and then does a collection and adds it to the collection. So then this is later used to be put into the SharePoint list. And then they get to a request form, and then they get to see all the items that they have requested. And this is a gallery with the Office 365 users and just a text input field. When we first started doing forms, especially request forms, we used the people picker field. And I don't know if you've used PowerApps before and used that people picker field. It's just not as user friendly for our users. And again, things that you wouldn't think would be a problem. People would enter the staff person's email address, and then the staff person's name would show up in the people picker, but they wouldn't click on it to select the person. So that was an issue. So we started switching to galleries for anything where you're finding a person and selecting that person. And you can filter your galleries by job title, department, location, name, a whole bunch of different categories. So once they have selected the person, then they can submit their request. And then it goes through 2 approval workflows. The first approval workflow goes to the principal, and they can say yes or no. Yes, we need these items, or no, we don't. And then it goes to our fulfillment area, and they can just confirm that this is stuff that they have on hand that they want to send out. And if they click approve, then it subtracts the item from the inventory list. So it's nice because then they can get a quick visual of what the inventory is. I know they were going to be doing a dashboard so they could do reporting up to cabinet and the superintendent about what we have for inventory on hand at the moment. So this is a nice way to have real-time inventory stats. We did the same kind of thing with the Power BI dashboard of showing devices that had been sent out to students, where it would take that SharePoint list data, put it to a Power BI dashboard, and then you could show how many hotspots, how many Chromebooks, what sites had requested what. So it's nice how everything within Microsoft is kind of connected and interrelated. One other use case that we use PowerApps, or actually the Microsoft 365 services for, is Microsoft Forms. There are many cases where you either want something really quick, so Microsoft Form you can set up in 5 minutes, and do a flow for it in 5 minutes and have something, pretty quick up and running. Or if you had external users that would not have PowerApps licensing, then a Microsoft form is often the way to go. So we did end up doing a lot of Microsoft forms, especially for those external users. The first form we did was a non-MPS staff account access. And like I talked about for the bus pass one, we had people who were not MPS staff, but for some reason needed access to our systems or our data because they worked with our students. So this form is for people to request an account with MPS if they are not one of our staff. But it needed an approval workflow because we needed them to be able to pick from a principal list. And we didn't want them to be able to select just anybody. And we couldn't find a good way to show like 200 different approvers. We used to have a Google form that had 200, a 200 person drop down list item, which was not very user friendly. So what we came up with was this email address field, is basically just a text field. And we sent them a link to our address book. So they need to first enter the supervisor's email address into the email address field. And you can use that as a handy way if you want to kick off an approval workflow or some other kind of workflow from a Microsoft form. So what it does is the first step is to get the user profile, which takes the email address of the supervisor that they've listed in the form. If that fails, it means that that person was not found in our address book, which means they probably mistyped the email address because our email addresses ended with mpls.k12.mn.us, which was not a very user-friendly email address. So if the user was not found for whatever reason in our address book, then it would update the SharePoint status and send an email back to the requester saying, you submitted a request, we're sorry, but this person does not exist in our address book, please try again. If they do end up having a successful supervisor email listed, then it would add the supervisor job title to the SharePoint item, and then it would use this Azure group list group members connector. And this group ID you can get from your global admin is where I got it from. So you'd need the group ID of the group members, and we had a group where anybody who had a supervisory title, there was a PowerShell script to automatically put those users into that group. So it was something where users got added automatically if they were a manager, principal, assistant principal, or director. Thing to note, if you're using this one and you have more than 100 things in there, the default is top 100. So since we had a little over 200 items in there, we needed to change that to have the top 999. So then it takes your group members in your manager group and then appends them to an array variable. And we noticed with these emails, we had to do everything as lower, because if you had some email addresses that had some uppercase and some lowercase letters, things weren't matching together. So we did a to lower, and then there would be a condition to check if the manager email array contained the, again, to lower of the email address of the person. So basically, was the supervisor they listed somewhere within this array of all of the managers? And if it was, then we could do our approval flow, send an email. And if the manager was not listed in the manager group, then it would send an email back to the requester saying, sorry, you've submitted a wrong kind of person. And that usually happened if they would put like their teacher instead of the principal as the person who should be approving the request. If you don't have an Azure group to pick, or if you don't want to have people have to enter an email address because it's not as great for user experience, you can also use a SharePoint list to kind of match that data up. So for this one, we had athletic officials who would request payment. So if you were an official at a football game at Patrick Henry High School, you would submit this request form, and then the athletic director at Patrick Henry would review it and then say, should you get paid, yes or no? So again, this one had two separate lists. One was the list of all the requests, and then one was the list of the approvers, which was, again, managed by our subject matter expert, the athletic director. So he would basically have a list that only had school site name, and then the contact person at that school site. So for this one, it created all of the items within the finance list, and then it would set this approver variable by getting items from the athletic approvers, where the school site matched whatever they had selected for there. So it was a matching up of using that filter query, which is really handy if you just want a small number of things, or if you want to say I'm only matching things that have this specific subject. So that filter query matched up the school site that they had selected in the Microsoft form with the school site listed on the SharePoint list, and then they could send the approval to the associated approver in the SharePoint list. In this one, after it was approved, it created an invoice, got all the content for the invoice, and then sent an email to our invoice management system. So it was really kind of a end-to-end automated process of like, they say, I want, I did this event, should be this much money, it got approved, created the invoice, send it out for payment, so that people could get paid by our accounts payable department. Another thing we use the Power Platform for a lot is working with Excel. There's a whole bunch of different use cases for Excel. People love Excel. They like it more than SharePoint lists, even though you can do a lot of really cool stuff with SharePoint lists. Just sometimes it's a lot easier to download stuff to Excel, make a bunch of quick edits. So for the automated flow option trigger with Excel, we do a lot of things with form surveys. Like they will take data from your form that was submitted with your Microsoft form and push it to either a SharePoint list item or an Excel document so that some other person can view the data and do things with the data. We also use Excel a lot for sending emails, so kind of as a replacement for Mail Merge or, Mail Merge Plus, where you can have all of your users listed. Like we had a voicemail box update, and so we had to send emails to all the different users with the custom attribute of their voicemail box. You can also take data that's in your SharePoint list, so we use this a lot if you needed to update data. You could take your data from your SharePoint list, export it to Excel, make your updates in there, and then do a flow that would write your updates back to your SharePoint list. So that's good if you have a bunch of different things within your SharePoint list that need to be updated. And then another thing we do is a regular push of data from Excel to other data sources with this scheduled flow option. There were some groups there was our early childhood group had a form, a Microsoft form, that pushed to a main master list of Excel. And then they wanted to also, create a spreadsheet for 8 different schools that would parse out the information from the main Excel to those 8 school sheets. And they said, but we want to know what the schools are writing in their Excel sheets. So for that, we had them do a scheduled flow where they took the data from those 8 schools, and nightly it would mush that data that they had edited back into the regular list. If you are using Excel, make sure that you watch your threshold limit. By default, I think it only sends like 256 items. So if you have 500 emails that you're trying to send, you would need to go into click the 3 dots, click on settings, and then you can change this limit here. If you end up having thousands of things in there, it does take a while to get through the whole flow, but it still works. And then use filter queries as well. If you have 10,000 items in your list and you only want to update the 300 you've made changes to, you can just have a column in there that says update, and it will find those 300 items and only update those. Don't hide your columns if you are using Excel. We had some flows that just were not working right in Excel because it was a 30 column document. People didn't want to see all that. They only wanted to see the 5. But we found that when we hid the columns, the flows were not working right. So make sure you're watching out for that. We have one spreadsheet that basically takes data from the transportation department, and then we sent out a survey for our transportation area. So it was a Microsoft form that people would fill that out, and then it would go to a master Excel list that could be viewable by a bunch of different people. And then the school said, we want to be able to see all of our data. So we had to take the data from that Excel sheet and push it out to the appropriate school. But because there were so many items within that Excel sheet, we only wanted stuff that was updated recently. So we did a filter query of the last updated date equals the current date, and then nightly it would take anything that had been updated recently, and then it would do a switch to push it based on the value of the school. If you are using switches, there is a 25 number limit. It's honestly a pain to set up anything more than 25. It's a pain to set up 25 switches of pushing to 25 separate Excel sheets. We had 70 schools, so I had to do 3 separate flows that pushed to various different schools. So that was fun time setting that up. So within my years at MPS, working with PowerApps and Power Automate, there's a bunch of different things I've learned. We've had a lot of different use cases, but one thing I wish I had known when I first started was to document all of my flows, not necessarily all the flow steps, but make sure you're documenting the URL of your flow. There's some wonky thing where every time I go into flow and I try and search for a flow by name, and I know the name of the flow, it does not pull the flow up. So make sure you're keeping track of those in a list somewhere, because they do get to be unwieldy if you're using them a lot. So that's something really important to be aware of. Like if you can have a list where that links you straight to where that flow is, it's going to be a lot easier to find and edit them later. Keep learning. I watch a lot of videos. People come to me with questions, and so I'm like, I think we can do that. We'll try and figure it out. I do a lot of Googling. I attend events like this, and I'm always checking the Microsoft roadmap. But there is new stuff that happens all the time, and Microsoft is always implementing new things. And if I had it to redo with all the new features that are available now, there's a lot of PowerApps and flows that I would have probably done differently, because there's new features that are available now that weren't available when I first started. And everything is connected within the Microsoft 365 world. The real benefit to using Microsoft 365 is that there are all these connectors that are integrated. So instead of having to go to a bunch of different systems, you really can start to build your business process automation environment with everything being connected. You can have forms that push to Excel lists, that push to SharePoint lists, that interact with PowerApps, that interact with Word documents. So there's so much that you can do. It can get overwhelming at times, but just take it, little chunk by little chunk, and learn as you go. And I think I've talked a little bit quickly, and unfortunately I was not able to do any demos. So if anybody has questions about specific apps or use cases. No questions. And that's all I've got, though. Does anybody have examples of things they've used that have been helpful? Oh, is Tiernan in here? Tiernan. Yep. Couple questions. What was adoption and acceptance like for your organization's staff when these new PowerApps were implemented? Good question. Thank you. I would say that the first one we did, like once we started using them, there was an issue kind of change management of everybody got really excited about us being able to use all of these different things. And so make sure that you have a change management process in place, because once people start to see, hey, you can make an app in a day and an associated workflow, or an app in a couple of days, the requests will start coming in very, very quickly. So if you don't have staff that are dedicated to be able to building them and then checking them and making sure they're all working correctly and that your flows are running right, it can just get to be a huge unwieldy kind of a thing. In general, people really liked them. I would say the biggest issue we had was with the automate workflows for users that didn't have the actionable messages, because they weren't able to easily click approve and go to the approval workflow. Have we used PowerApps to address any changes with return to work and COVID? That was thrown out there. So Microsoft has, and I don't know if any of you have seen it within the PowerApps environment, they have like kind of a pre-built return to work thing. So we deployed that and used the app. So it has a pre-built app in there that can show you location data. People can, do a checklist of, are you feeling well? So I did work with our nursing department to get that set up, and they had questions, and they were going to do questionnaires to ask people, do they have any symptoms? Were they going to be on site? And we built it all out according to their specifications. But then there was, I guess, kind of an issue of, did we want to collect staff health data or not? And it was kind of decided that they did not want to do that at the time, and so we didn't end up using that app. But there is a pre-built Microsoft solution for the return to work. Yeah, I wish I could show actual, like an actual demo, but unfortunately, I don't have access to any of my Minneapolis apps anymore. At my new job, I've already started building some apps and flows there, and using Power Automate to create SharePoint template pages. So if you use, does anybody use site designs at their organization? So we have site designs for our SharePoint pages, which can kick off a flow. But getting like that page template in there, my new job didn't realize that that was a function that you can kind of do within Flow. So we used Flow to get a page template from an existing site, and then use the HTTP SharePoint connector to copy it over to whatever site the site design was applied to. So there's a lot of powerful stuff you can use Flow for, and PowerApps. Any other questions? I know I tend to talk too fast. Or I know that Tiernan was supposed to be giving away a gift card, so everybody's probably waiting for the gift card giveaway.
That will come at the end, Lisa.
Shoot, I honestly, I know I was supposed to go for 75 minutes, but unfortunately I went through the presentation too quickly.
No, not a problem. I can pull up the randomizer right now and do the gift card run through. And the winner is unknown user. Okay, let's do that again. The winner is Mr. Jason Wara. So Jason, I will use the email address that you have logged in with. If there is one that you want, a different one you want it sent to, just shoot me a private message and I'll send it to that one.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep.
Lisa, thank you very much for your time and your presentation. I found it very educational. I'm sure there's a bunch of public sector and education people on here who did as well. For those of you who are staying on the automation track, this meeting will keep running. I'm going to stop the recording, but this meeting will keep running, so you don't need to close it out and rejoin later. Our next session is the, let's see, it's the lunchtime keynote speaker, which I think is the Teams apps, the Teams information from Ignite. So you will have to leave this meeting to join that. You can find the link to it on the MN365 events page. If anyone has any issues getting to it, just shoot me a PM and I will send you the link. Lisa, quick question. Will you be sharing out your slide deck for anyone who wants it?
Yep, I can get that. Should I just send that to you? I don't have a link to it currently.
Yeah, if you want to create a link and just send it to me, I'll put it into the chat and or email it out to anyone who requests it.
Can do.
Excellent. Well, thank you all again for participating and joining this event. If you're staying on the automation track, I'll see you back here at 1 o'clock. In the meantime, enjoy your half-hour break before lunch and the lunch keynote.